So I'll start with a comment as usual. And if you're using any sounds or anything like that, this would be a good place to add references or citations. But I'm not going to have sound in here. But if your final project involves sound, you could, or images, you could put some info there. So what I want to do is basically have a couple different buttons that advance the slides. And I want to have different parts of my presentation that are being drawn on each different slide. So I'm going to start with a slide count. So I have a variable slide count, and this is what this is how many slides I'm going to have. So you can have as many slides as you want. I'm going to just start with 3 to keep it simple, and then I'll have a variable called current slide, and I'll start at 0. Or let's start at 1, make it a little less confusing. So whatever the current slide is what we're going to draw on the canvas. And so then we can check which slide it is, and whichever slide we're looking at, then we'll draw those graphics. And if we click the next button or the previous button, we'll go to the next slide. And so this is going to introduce a slightly new topic, which we'll get to in a second. We've kind of looked at it with our HTML buttons, but we'll go over in a second. We'll have to use a couple of functions to determine which slide we're going to go to. So to start, let's just draw our first slide just so we can get a sense of what it looks like, and then we'll set up our buttons. So we just want to check which slide we're on. So we'll say if current slide equals 1. And then everything that we want on our current slide can basically go in between these brackets. You could also create a function if you wanted to have like a specific function to handle the slide, so you don't have to have everything in this big if statement. But we can also put everything here. So for this one, I'm just going to have like a title. So I'll just have some text, and I'll say my final project. It's just kind of filler text. You can call this whatever you want. And I'll just put it in the middle of the canvas. So I'm going to make the canvas a little bit bigger than what it normally is, so I have more space to work with. So let's do 600 by 400. So I'll say my final project, and I'll put it at width over 2, height over 2. So it'll be in the middle of the canvas. And so we can see it there. I'm going to make a couple adjustments. So I'm going to change the text align to say center, center. So the text is centered vertically and horizontally. And then I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So let's say like 50 pixels. Okay, that looks pretty good. And if you want to change the font, you can change the font. You can leave the default. You can change the color, whatever other styling you might want to do. So this is if our current slide equals 1. And so then we want to be able to advance the slide to show the next part of our presentation. So let's handle that, and then we'll come back and design the rest of the project. So we're going to have a couple different buttons for the next slide and the previous slide. And so we're going to define, just like we did before, a rectangle button. And we'll have to detect whether the user is clicking in it or not. So I'm going to set that up, and then we'll set up the functionality. So for this one, I'm going to create a new function down here called button. And for now, I'm just going to go with the X and Y. They're going to be the same size, and I don't have a sound. So I just need the position of the button. And I'm always going to be drawing these buttons in the presentation. So I'll just have my first button. And let's put this one, you can put them in the bottom right corner. So we'll say width minus 50, height minus 50, something like that. And then we'll put another button that's width minus 50, height minus 25. And so what I'm doing with this math here, maybe you can tell already, but essentially what I'm doing is using width and height. So I'm kind of like moving down here, and then I'm subtracting from there. So width minus 50 is somewhere, height minus 50 here, height minus 25. So I'm using the size of the canvas to decide where I want to put the buttons. So if I change the size of the canvas later, they'll update to move with it. So then let's draw a little rectangle. So I'll draw a rectangle at x, y. And we don't need them to be particularly large. So we can have the width be like 50 and the height be like 20. And let's put a little rounded edge on them. Okay, so we have a couple of little rectangles. And they're kind of close to the edge. So maybe we do like 40, something like that. And let's make the stroke weight a little bit wider, just a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. They might be a little too small. So let's do 50 for the width, and let's move them back a little bit. So I'll do width minus 60 instead of width minus 50. Oops. So you could put the buttons next to each other. You could put them in the top right or top left. It doesn't really matter. You can put them wherever makes sense for you. So now we need some text to draw on the button so we know which is which. And so since they're different, we can use an argument to decide which text to draw. So we can say, we can't use text because that's already a function. So let's use direction. I'll just call it dir for which slide is which. So we'll have the top one be next, and we'll have the bottom one be previous. And then I'm just going to draw the text on top of my rectangle. So I'll say text with the direction and the X and Y. We might have to move these around a little bit, but we'll get started. So the text is too big. That's the first thing I have to fix. But notice that, using this function means that everything is relative to this XY. So I don't have to like figure out what the XY is again for my text. They're going to start kind of in the right place at least. So the text size has to be smaller. Let's try like 16. That's pretty good. And now notice the text is in the top left corner of my rectangle, because the rectangle by default draws from the top left, but I set up my text to align center. So we can set the text align back to the default. We can say left, and what would be, I think bottom is the right one for this, or maybe top. Yeah, I actually want top because the top is the top of the text. Okay, so that looks pretty good. The previous is a little too long, so we're going to have to make our buttons a little bit bigger. But then let's move it in just a little bit. So maybe like 8 pixels. So I'll do x plus 8, y plus 8. It's a little bit too much. Let's try 4. Okay, that's pretty good. And now I just need to make my buttons bigger. So let's try, I'll I'll move these back like 100 to give myself some space. And then I'll try making my buttons a little bigger, maybe like 80. Okay, maybe like 75. Okay, so that's pretty good. You might want to change the text alignment, but I think this looks decent. Trying to decide which button should be on top or bottom. I kind of feel like previous should be on top. Not really sure why. So let's change this to previous. Change this to next. For some reason that looks a little bit better. And maybe we could align these to the right and then move. Yeah, let's do that. That's going to look better. So let's move X over. We'll say X plus like 60 or 70. Okay, that looks better for some reason. Doesn't really matter that much. Doesn't change the functionality, but I think that looks pretty good. And let's change this to like 90 so we have a little bit closer to the edge. Okay, that looks good enough. So now we have to actually set up the functionality for this. And so we're going to use what's called a callback function. So this is a function that's run once some event occurs. And so we use callback functions when we did the HTML buttons, but now we're creating our own buttons, so we have to actually manage the callback functions ourselves. So first we have to actually detect if we're clicking on the button. So let's do that up here. So we're going to use the same code we used on Monday. We're just going to check if the mouse is inside of our button, and then if the mouse is pressed, and then instead of playing a sound, we'll put our callback function here. So we do need to know the width and the height of the button, which is 75 and 20. So let's add those values here. So we'll say W for width is 75, height is 20. And now I can replace these guys here. And so we'll say if mouse X is greater than X to start. So if our mouse is on the right side of our X value, which is right here for each button. So that's our first condition. And mouse X is less than our X plus our width. So same thing we did on Monday. So we're just testing to see is the X greater than here, this side, and less than this side. And if it is, then it's inside of our button. So we need to check based on the position, the X, as well as the size of our button. So we have two more conditions. I'm going to do another ampersand, and we're going to do the same thing on the Y. So mouse Y has to be greater than Y, and mouse Y has to be less than Y plus height. So if all those things are true, let's change the fill to gold again, and we should see that work. But we also have to change the fill back to whatever it is. So else, if that's not true, fill is, just stick with the default white. And then for our text, now we need to change the fill. So say fill is black. And so now we have the hover state. And so then let's add the active state. So we'll say if mouse is pressed. So this is inside of my original if statement. Then we'll fill blue. Uh-oh. Did I miss something? Oh, yeah, I always do this. Okay, I have to put this in an else statement. So I still had the fill gold regardless of whether the mouse was pressed, so it's always covering over the fill blue. But if I put that in an else statement, now we'll get this active state. So that gives us the visual component of our button. That lets the user know that we're hovering over the button, that we've clicked the button, and now we just need the action of the button. So if we click on next, we want to go to the next slide. If we click on previous, we want to go to the previous slide. So we need two different functions to do those things, and then we can give them to our button as a callback, and it will call that function. So our first function is next slide, and our next function is previous slide. And so for the next slide, what we want to do first is check to see if we're still inside of our slide count, because we don't want to go to a slide that doesn't exist. So we're going to say if current slide is less than slide count, then current slide plus plus. We're just going to increase the number of the current slide. So it's pretty simple. We just want to check, make sure we have more slides, and then go to the next slide. And so the way this is set up, once I get to the last slide, if I hit the next button, it'll just not go anywhere. So you could have it cycle back to the beginning. You could say else current slide equals 0. But for this example, I'm just going to kind of make it stick at the end. Okay, so then for our previous, if the current slide is greater than 0, or actually greater than 1, because 1 is our first slide. So as long as the slide is 2 or 3, then we can go back to the previous slide. So we'll say current slide minus minus. Oops. I just saved the sketch, didn't really need to do that. So now we have to put in our two callback functions into our button. And so when we put arguments into a value, when we put arguments into a function, that these arguments go from being specific, these numbers, to generic, x or y or direction. So we start with the specific functions that we want to call. So the previous button calls the previous slide function. And JavaScript is nice because we can just throw it in there. We don't really have to change anything. Whereas a lot of other languages, we'd have to make a delegate or do some other crazy stuff to pass a function as an argument. Okay, so that's our code for our two callback functions. And so in our button, we can just say, we'll call this a callback. And so if we press the mouse, then we'll just call our callback function. So we just say callback and then parentheses. So when we're referring to the function as data, we don't need the parentheses because we're not actually executing the function. We don't want the function to run when we're drawing the button. When we use the parentheses, that's when this callback function is actually going to execute and run the code. And I just realized we're going to run into another issue. I forgot to bring up another parameter that we need, but we'll add that in a second. Okay, so now if I go to my next button and my previous button, we can see that my slide changes. We haven't created the new slides yet, but we can at least see that our buttons are working. So let's draw the slide that we're on because I forgot to add one variable that we need. So let's take a look. So I'm just going to draw text, draw the current slide, and put it up in the top right corner. And so we're on slide 1, and notice that we go all the way to slide 3, and we skip 2. So the reason for this is because if mouse press, we're running this whole button in our draw function. And so when we have mouse press, this is actually running more than once as the draw function is going. So unless we go like really super fast, which I don't think we can do, we're going to skip the second slide. So there's a few different ways that we can deal with this. We can add in more data to keep track of what slide we're on. We can add in another function to check if we've released the mouse, or another variable to check if we've released the mouse first before we change the slide. Or we could use a mouse pressed function that also runs our button functions separately. So let's just do a Boolean, because this will be a little bit easier. So we'll say mouse is, oh, we already have mouse is pressed. So let's call this mouse was pressed. So we'll say mouse was pressed. And this starts out as false. And so we can say if mouse is pressed, we'll run this callback. And then we'll set mouse was pressed to true. And so then we can add in a compound variable here. So we'll say mouse is pressed and not mouse was pressed. And then else, if mouse is no longer pressed, then we can set mouse was pressed back to false. So this won't happen until we release the mouse. So this is a pretty common way of dealing with this issue of knowing when an event has finished, is we set another Boolean to check. We can set whether or not the mouse was pressed, and then check again once we release the mouse. So this should fix our problem. Nope. Let's see. What did I miss? Okay, we have not mouse was pressed. Mouse was pressed equals true. Else, fill gold. Mouse was pressed equals false. Okay. Missed something. See if I have any errors. No. Okay, so we'll have to do some debugging. So let's put in our next slide, well, console.log current slide, and open up the console. Just check and make sure that's what's happening. Okay, so we're going 1, 2, 3. Okay. So then let's add into our console, mouse is pressed, mouse was pressed, and see what's happening there. Okay, so they're both false. True, 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 false. True, 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 false. Okay. Oh, maybe I screwed up the order. Okay, so if mouse is pressed and not mouse was pressed, then we'll do this. Oh, I need to add another else if. So else if, then, or actually, let's just make this. So if mouse is pressed, let's put this inside here. So I was a little too. So we want to still fill blue, but we want to say if not mouse was pressed. Then we want our callback. And then we want to flip the mouse press. There we go. Okay. So I got a little bit too tricky with this one. I didn't need to add a compound Boolean here. I want to check. So I want to do something if the mouse is pressed or not. And the issue I was having is I was only checking if both of these things were true. And so as soon as I was setting the mouse was pressed to to true, I was skipping this statement and going straight to this statement. So that was setting it back to false, and then we're just going in a big loop. Okay, so now we have a next and a previous button. So we don't need HTML to create buttons. We can create them on our own. Let's remove these logs. And now we can design the rest of our slides. So the next slide, so we want to start, we just have the name of the project. And so that's pretty easy. So now we can go to the next one. We can say else if current slide equals 2. And so here is where we can talk about what the project will have in it, like the theme of the project or the graphics, or you can do this in different orders depending on what the project is. But we want to talk about the interaction, what type of graphics, and then just the general theme. I should put theme in here. So let's say I wanted to expand on one of my projects. So I would go over here, go to open, and open up my collection for the semester and choose a project that I liked. So let's see, what was a good project? Maybe my nested for loop example. Okay, that's pretty cool. So maybe I could expand on this and add in some images so it has an external file, or I could add sounds that play when I click on the different buttons, and maybe I could assign those sounds randomly, like I'm drawing the graphics randomly. So I have something that I can work with here, and so I can talk about, I'm going to use my my project, my nested loop project, and what I'm going to add to it. So I'll add some more text. So I am going to expand on the nested for loop project, adding, let's say I'm going to add sounds when clicking on each cell in the grid. And I have to put in XY for this, so let's make this one left aligned. So we'll say text align is left and let's say top. And let's make the text size a little bit smaller, so we'll say like 25. And so I'll put this at, let's just do 50 pixels on the right and 50 pixels from the top. Or let's do 100 pixels from the top. We can adjust it. And so when you're developing it, one thing that you can do, so I have to go to the next slide to see this, and that might be kind of annoying. So I can actually go and change the current slide in my variable. So I can change this to 2. And so now if I run my code, it's already on the second slide. I can make changes here, and then I can always go back and change my current slide back to 1 later. So this is kind of a simple thing, but when you're working on a project that has lots of different components, it makes it faster to debug and to change what you're working on. So this looks pretty good, but it's not wrapping. So let's give it a width. So if I want my text to wrap, I need a width. So let's give the width of the canvas minus 100. So I'm doing 2 times 50 here. So the margin on the left and the right will both be 50. And so that looks pretty good. And so now we can just add in a sample of the graphics. So I could copy and paste all of this stuff, or I could just take an image of this and add my image in here. Either one of those would be fine. I'm just going to copy it because that's a little bit easier. Although this one doesn't, I don't want it to loop. So what do I do for that? I'll just take an image then. Or I could just draw this. Yeah, I'll do this. I'll make this a function. I'll take out the no loop. I'll make this a function. I'll just draw it in the background. So let's copy this. And go back to my final project. It's getting a little messy. I have a lot of different functions. I'm going to paste this in here. And let's just call this pattern. And we'll take out the background. Take out the no loop. And we'll do this on the next slide. So we'll say else if, I'm going to put a space here. Current slide equals 3. And then I'll draw my pattern. So if I go to the next one, oh yeah, it is going to look kind of crazy. Oh, and I offset these guys here because I'm using rect mode center. Okay, so let's make sure our buttons are rect mode corner. Oh, and they also have stroke is black. Oops. Oh, that's just for the rectangles. Okay, so this is no stroke for the text. There we go. Okay. Okay, so now this looks kind of crazy for the visuals. Let's see, what do I need to do to only draw this once? I'm using the draw, so I could take out the background, but it'll keep going. Could turn off no loop, but then I wouldn't be able to change the slides. I could take out some of the randomness, but then it wouldn't look the same. Okay. So let's just take an image, that'll be easier. Just gonna get rid of this. So I'll go back here and just grab an image. So I'll say function mouse pressed, save pattern.png. Okay. And then I'll just upload this. So I'll go to sketch files, upload file, and go to my downloads and grab that pattern. And so now I can just load this image in. So I'll say variable pattern image and add my preload function. Pattern image gets load image pattern.png. And so now instead of drawing the pattern, I can just draw an image, draw my pattern image, and I'll put it in the center. So I'll say width over 2, height over 2. And I'll have to do image mode center so that it draws in the center. Okay, so it's much bigger than this sketch for some reason. It's okay. I'll just leave it as is. Okay. So now let's set my current slide back to 1. And so I have my final project. I'm just saying, explaining what the project is. I'm going to expand on the nested for loop, adding sounds when clicking on each cell in the grid. And then here's some graphics as an example. So that's just a few examples of slides and how you can build them. For the final project, remember that you also have to talk about how the user is going to interact, although I kind of address that when I say clicking on each cell grid, but include what the user interaction is going to be. So I'll put that in here. So for final project, I don't need a comment here. So we need to know the theme. This is like what colors, what graphics, anything that you're going to use. Colors, graphics, sounds, etc. Interaction. So how is the user going to interact with the project? And the project itself has to include these things, but you don't have to talk about that in the final project. Oh yeah, explain if it's a new project or updating an old project. So I think that's pretty easy. Shouldn't take more than a few slides to cover that stuff. And you can use this as a template, or you can try creating this sketch, creating your own buttons. You could also use key presses to update the slides, or you could use both if you wanted to. So yeah, that's basically it. Any questions? Well, you don't. So I have like it depends on what you want to do. You don't really need like a title slide, but you can have that if you want. So that's one. An explanation. So this is kind of like the theme. That's two. Then some example of the graphics. You can have more than one, however many you need, but at least one example of the graphics. So that's three. And then the interaction. So at least four, I think, but it depends on how complicated it is. Other questions?